I'm interested in what this looks like, not only for what it is that we're talking about here, but then how can specific domains, and in my case, I'm thinking about food, either replicate the same kind of model within their domain, or else find a way to latch on to what you're talking about, and maybe, you know, I'm imagining things like code sprints around this. I think one of the things that we talked about in the last meeting that I thought was interesting, it kind of surfaced. I don't remember exactly how it surfaced, but when we think about using big data and AI and security, one of the things that I think is worth thinking about is that we only know some components of specific domains that might want to be sort of private or obscured in order to prevent exploitation. And so I think that there's a real need at the domain level, and when I say domain, I mean like scientific domains, to review what are the exploitable sort of data components that that would potentially be important. And one of the examples that we talked about was on Facebook, for instance, and thinking about social media. No one had really sort of predicted this idea that you could scrape people's public information about their music tastes and a variety of other things, and then turn it into a disinformation campaign and sway political beliefs and things like that. So what does it look like? I'm interested in that as a model for protecting food in general.
Okay, very cool.
As an example. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Great. And Jay, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Very quickly. Thank you for the summary, Florence and Caroline. I really appreciate that you're wanting to work with the team. I think that's a very good endeavor. Thank you for that. So I just want to add one quick comment here is that for data management or AI ML for cybersecurity, indeed there has been a lot of work out there, absolutely. And I agree with Caroline that there are a lot of black boxes. And a lot of them actually, not only that they're black boxes, they are not usable for practitioners. So I think one of my goals, and I think what a working group can do is to advocate and also gathering some thoughts on what will be the really usable type of solutions from a practitioner perspective, and they are doable from researchers. So I actually got off from the TTP call that Florence is familiar with Ryan. And one of the things we talk about is that it's been very challenging for the researchers to fully understand the type of problems that a practitioner might have. At the same time, it'd be very difficult for a practitioner to describe the problem of interest and sometimes the problems of the future for the researchers, right? Because this match need to happen. And I think it takes some time, just like most of the problem definition of, let's say, a research project usually take half of time to finalize what the problem is. So I think that the iteration between practitioners and researchers is very important. And in this case, practitioners could be industry, could be government, could be higher ed, could be high performance computing, and so on and so forth. So I think that I would suggest that the working group consider one of the topics in the upcoming year is to think about how to further facilitate the practitioners' real-world problems and real-world concerns, as well as that they might have a question, I know that those tools, but which one can I use, kind of thing, and create a venue for them to interact with researchers in a meaningful way. I think that will be good for this working group to foster that dialogue more.
Yes, these are all great comments. Any other comments anyone else wants to add that's been involved? John McMullen or anybody else, or anyone who's just listening, your thoughts on this idea?
Yeah, thanks, Florence, and thanks to the other participants today. I just wanted to mention that you know, the hubs are really convening entities, and you can see the convening power given the breadth of interest that folks have, whether it's, you know, corporate data management or food or whatever the domain area is. There's a broad interest in this topic across the regions here. We were talking the other day on the planning call about, you know, whether it's the food system or the gas pipeline or, you know, any of the other places where we've had security incidents recently. You know, it's touching all parts of society. And so using the hubs as sort of the vehicle to drive this conversation amongst different groups, I think is pretty valuable. And we can really leverage some of the other partners that we already have, whether that's the Trusted CI group that we've been a long time partner with, especially with Florence on that group, or whether it's the AI institutes, which have, you know, a certain level of cybersecurity interest along with their AI ML, you know, mission, and certainly other programs at NSF that have funded lots of cybersecurity tools and resources over the years. So I just feel like the hubs are a great way to start to bring together some of these threads and make some actual progress on this stuff.
I might just add one thought, building on some things that Carolyn and Jay said, and also kind of prior meetings around this topic. Often the chasm between academic and industry is kind of exacerbated by kind of a missing common interest. In this instance, it feels like there's a pretty good opportunity where the practitioners have data, which the academic community lacks, meaningful data, and the academic community has new ideas. And as John said, I think the last couple of weeks has made it clear that the security community is in dire need of new ideas, however far out. So it does feel like there's a basis for kind of common interest. I will comment that it's maybe 4 or 5 years ago, worked on a consortium that had maybe 6 or 7 financial institutions sharing this kind of data. It made sharing a PII for you know, clinical use look easy. So it's not an easy lift, and it requires a bunch of trust, but it feels like, especially now, there might be motivation to make it happen.
Excellent comments. Okay, I've taken some notes while you all were talking. Oh, hey, Anton, you're here too. Is there anything you wanted to add? We were just talking about where we go from here in the cybersecurity work. Anton's from Northwestern. He's in John's backyard or side yard, I think. He might be unmutable right now, but you can always join in. So that's what we're thinking for cybersecurity. So as you could hear, we'd like to keep going on this. And we'd like to figure out the best way to do that. It could be a workshop would be part of it. It could be something else would be part of it. And so I think those are the things we can bring into the discussion with Niall when we meet later this month. Does that make sense to everybody, or any other comments on that? Thumbs up, thumbs down. No thumbs. Okay. Thumbs up. Okay, great. Yeah, you can use your thumbs, Jim. You're not allowed to use your voice, but you can use your thumbs. No, I'm kidding. Okay, very good. Excellent. Okay, now why don't we get into our lightning talk discussion, which is further ideas for future topics in the fall in 2021. And it could be ideas like this or totally different, especially where we can leverage our convening capability, as John McMullen was saying. You know, we're good at bringing people together, listening, and then helping them work together. So any other ideas for future topics in the fall of 2020, either that you've been harboring for years or you just thought of, or in between? Is there any other follow-up from the Trustworthy Data Working Group that we need to do? John, or do you think this is like a good example of what we could be doing? Because you and I were kind of in the middle of that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good example of what I was talking about, where, you know, we did a readiness assessment of the community and some surveys, and, you know, produced some guidance documents. And so those kinds of activities I think are appropriate here, but, you know, going beyond that and maybe having a workshop or doing some proposal development, you know, and really trying to move things forward.
Okay, so follow on opportunity. Go ahead.
I've taken myself off mute, so you get to hear my raspy voice again. But, you know, something that John, I think this would resonate with John as well, because we were on a call earlier this morning that talked about sort of middle layers for making access to data more seamless, in sort of recognizing specifically that it's not going to happen for us to be able to create a gigantic repository of all the data that we would like to see to do our research. Rather, those data are going to reside in many different places. And there's an active community now and some really fairly mature examples of activities or research areas where they're doing a relatively nice job aggregating these data using, you know, RESTful interfaces and so forth. You know, some of the use cases I think would be interesting to talk about. Some of the successes and where they've had difficulties would be interesting. And I know Matthew and I have spoken about this with respect to ontologies and food. And there's some, I think, some really exciting examples in that space. And then John and I were talking about it in the context of water resources. So I think it'd be fun to see some emphasis on data sort of middle layers to help aggregate specific sort of research data types together.
Very interesting. I don't want to make you talk more, but have you seen anybody try this well? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. You know, I think in agriculture, this has been a strong focus of ours in terms of developing the GEMS platform, which I've talked about with this group earlier, a couple of years ago. I think HydroShare is doing some fantastic things in that area as well. In fact, GEMS is collaborating with HydroShare to sort of more seamlessly be able to share data that are of interest to both the ag community and the water resources community. It's a really good example, actually. But yeah, I think those are two sort of examples that are top of mind. I can think of others that are beginning to come to fruition that have to do with food also, but are much more sort of narrowly focused in certain food areas.
Okay.
I think more broadly, we've, over the past however many years the working group's been going on, we've seen, and HydroShare was a really good example of that, as well as GEMS, platforms that are doing a really nice job of kind of creating portals into masses of information specific to a domain. SDSC, I think, talked about wildfires. I think there was an analogous thing around hurricanes. We had a couple of good presentations about transportation-related data. I don't know if you want. There's one possible theme is either recapping or trying to mash those ideas up a little bit to get more cross-fertilization, the way you've done, Jim, with food. I don't know if that takes us anywhere, but I'll just make that observation.
So on that note, we're actually going to be writing a proposal for NSF that was kind of a follow-on from the COVID Info Commons regarding bringing pandemic, we're calling it PICNIC, Pandemic Information Commons, and Natural Hazard and Disaster Information Commons, and bringing the information and the humans and the processes, the models, the data together so that we can make decisions about, human safety as an example during a pandemic and a hurricane. You can't throw everybody into the Superdome like you used to do 15 years ago. That's not going to work anymore. Or the same thing with other flooding. And fires turn into floods because of the scarring on the earth and all this stuff. And then what do? how do you learn from the past and how do you predict what would be better for the future? So this natural hazard and cascading disasters, which is how they talk about it, which sounds so sad, but how they say it. So in the world of pandemics and natural hazards and cascading disasters, that might be an interesting topic. And as you say, John, there are hurricane people, there are wind people, there are flood people, there are wildfire people. There are these NARI awards, the natural hazard.
In Boston, traffic is a disaster too. So they count. Yeah.
So they don't. So the rule in the natural hazard.
I can confirm that. Although it's not as bad now that COVID happened. So.
Yeah, that's a benefit. Yeah.
It's almost as bad in New York again. So yeah, interestingly, the hazard people say there are no such things as natural disasters. There are natural hazards. And when humans do something to mess it up, it becomes a disaster. So that's how they talk about it. And apparently the UN talks about it that way too. So I can't use the words natural and disaster together anymore since I've been schooled on that. But that might be a very interesting topic, for the future. And I think Niall had brought that up, Chris, right?
Yes, a couple meetings ago, I believe that was brought up. Yeah, as a possible topic of interest.
Yeah, the NSF NARI awardees, like at TAC. Actually, he would probably know them. Maybe that's why he's bringing it up. I think Design Safe is down there, which brings together a lot of the natural hazard data.
One of the things that's been kind of pleasing about the security conversations is they've aimed in the general direction of something actionable. And this feels like it might be a nexus that we could also steer in the direction of something both actionable and new. This idea of kind of the cross products of hazards feels like a new-ish idea that might bear some fruit.
It is actually, and there may be an opportunity to think about the cyber infrastructure and data sharing elements of that, right? Like, is there leverage of OSN, or is there something else we can thinking about? We think a lot about data sharing and always have, and then we get to MOUs and who has permission, we're like, forget it, Yeah. So, but maybe that's some of the stuff we can get into by working with these different researchers.
One of the areas that we're thinking a lot about is supply chain reconfigurability in response to disruptions in supply chains, which clearly we're not the only ones thinking about it. President Biden has put out an executive order, asking his cabinet members to do things, and the Secretary of Agriculture has similarly put out a request for comment on how we can do things like this. So it's not just about those disasters, but how do we respond in an intelligent way in order to reconfigure? I would say so. Can we build a cyber infrastructure that's capable of helping us reconfigure our physical infrastructure in order to respond to these types of events that you're talking about, whether they're a pandemic or a superstorm or whatever they are.
It's a nice example of kind of Florence's division between there's the natural event and the disaster really depends on how we respond or absence thereof.
Right, exactly. And so I think supply chains are a nice sort of hook to think about in terms of how can we design our supply chain systems in such a way that they are reconfigurable so that we can respond nimbly and have more resilient systems in place.
Very good. I also, when I think of supply chains, I think of the data supply chain too. As we look at like these natural hazards and disasters and how the data comes together. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
So, and in food, we think about the provenance of the data and the provenance of the physical item as it moves through the supply chain. And they're two very different things.
Right.
I have the advantage of not having thought about it carefully, but there's kind of an interesting matrix of bad things that can happen, and then there's kind of social structures, if you will, that either respond well or poorly. Supply chains one, physical infrastructure is another, public health is clearly another. We've learned over the last little while, and interestingly intersects with supply chain when you talk about test kits and such.
Vaccines.
Yeah. For us, one of the, just as another quick for example, the real sort of rude awakening around the pandemic was when we were watching essentially a couple, I'll give you two examples. One is watching farmers who normally served restaurants having to plow their crops under because they couldn't access grocery store supply chains. And at the same time, the lines at the food bank are getting longer. Like, that just doesn't make any freaking sense to anybody, right? It just doesn't make any sense. And then sort of the, I guess I could just stop there. I don't need to keep going with examples.
No, it's a good point. For a little while, I was able to get those really big strawberries that they only usually have in expensive restaurants. And I was like, why can't I get those anymore? They decided, they made more money before. I'm like, but please, we love them. I'll pay a little more.
I'll give one more example, and that is when we saw COVID outbreaks in some of these large meat processing facilities. There were large sections of the country that didn't have access to meat anymore.
Yeah.
And so as we've centralized our food production and processing, we've created these enormous single points of failure. And so we are not as resilient as we could be in terms of our food supply chains. So just thinking in terms of even the numbers of points or, the nodes in the network and where those vulnerabilities lie, I think is a huge thing. And something that I think a group like this, thinking about AI and security together, could really sort of think about those things in an abstract context, and what are the essential elements of the networks that we care about in order to enable this kind of responsive reconfigurability kind of thing.
Electrical power distribution is another example of that, where the ISOs have actually done a remarkable job of keeping the infrastructure resilient, but are about to face massive challenges with intermittent sources of energy.
Except in Texas.
Texas has it nailed, yeah.
Not so much.
They thought they did.
Well, it's a good example of how if you take your eye off the ball,
yeah.
Or if you optimize for something other than resilience, which is maybe a different way to think about it.
Or if you do it on the cheap.
Yeah.
You don't optimize for resilience and people maintaining their facilities.
Yeah. And to be fair, I think both in your case, Matt, and that you cited, and in the Texas case, they were optimizing for the 99% of the time when cost matters more than resilience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's just a whole, a lot of the supply chain faults that we had in the pandemic and over the last year are because of optimization. So I work in an optimization industry, and our software helps people optimize their inventory, and it's great until something like COVID happens and completely upsets the apple cart, completely reconfigures all the models and all of the supply and demand relationships. And then at that case, optimization doesn't really help.
That's
right.
that
was kind of my point about optimizing for reconfigurability, as opposed just to optimizing for specific, economies of scale type efficiencies.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've gotten really good, especially in manufacturing, of optimizing, how many parts do I have for this? How many of these am I going to build today, and how many parts do I need? And I only have the number of parts that I absolutely need in order to build one of those things. And then as soon as you can't, that kind of depends on the fact that you can get those parts really easily. And when you can, it just messes everything up.
I have a question related to this supply chain, which I think is I'm not an expert in any way stretched to about this, but I'm curious about whether there could be a topic on what kind of data that general people like me, right, can access to understand the supply chain issue, and that may also relate to public policy during the pandemic, whether there's any policy that changed because of COVID and therefore affect the supply chain issue, not necessarily just food, medical supplies, right? Recent vaccine, there might be economic issues behind it. There might be demand and supply issue behind it. I don't know, I'm just throwing things out. Politics behind it. So I'm curious of whether there's any lighting talk or the right people that's not necessarily in the big data group, but could have good insights that we can learn from and understand more, particularly in the sense of whether they are, how do data scientists, let's say a public policy person who are investigating, understanding, researching the supply chain issues during the whole pandemic, right? Whether it's, I don't know whether it's the same for food or drug or whatever it is. I'm curious about that, right? So the comment that you talked about, Florence, earlier. A lot of this COVID related comment were there or data were there. But how about this supply chain kind of thing? Matthew, you mentioned about food, meat. I'm curious about for general people like me, right? General public, I'm a public person, and what kind of data accessible, not accessible, what kind of things can be done. One of the things that was very surprising to all of us is that the COVID data all over the world was shared so easily among us. Right? Of course, there's a lot of money pumped behind it, but how about meat supply, Matthew mentioned? How about vaccine supply today? I don't know. I'm just asking from a data science, big data perspective, that what kind of data accessible, not accessible, and for this kind of problems.
Yeah, I would say a lot of it's probably proprietary, right? So if you look at like food supplies and stuff, I don't know of too many open data sets. I don't know, maybe Matthew does, but
well, so that's part of it, right? And part, I mean, I think there's things that need to happen in the marketplace where the transparency and traceability becomes a higher valued commodity. The transparency and traceability of the food and of the data, as we were talking about, sort of the provenance of each one of those things. So that has to happen. But on another level, it's not just about whether the data is proprietary, but it's about how has it been essentially encoded. And I think this is a real role for data science to come in. When we can talk about ontologies, and we can talk about, how are we actually structuring this data so that we're all sort of speaking the lingua franca, so to speak, and able to exchange data. And so that friction essentially disappears.
So on that note, one of the other questions in here is thoughts and ideas for new collaborations for the working group. Are there groups or individuals or institutions or organizations that we should be collaborating with that would help us in these endeavors or other endeavors that we're interested in?
Florence, is there an example of a productive collaboration that kind of fits your image of this? I mean, this group is, a bunch of people collaborating, in some ways. The hub's collaborating. And how do we have a collaboration of collaborators?
Yeah, so I think, the Trusted CI collaboration has grown over the past couple of years, I think. It started with the Trustworthy Data Working Group and the meeting we had at the bar outside at PERC, I think it was, where we all agreed to work together. Very productive meeting. And then we started working together. The collaboration that we have going on with IEEE on connected healthcare cybersecurity, I think is very interesting for a number of people who are involved. From IEEE, from the hubs, from anywhere really. It's IEEE, so it's an international organization with over 400,000 people in it. And what I was just thinking is there something else we could be doing with somebody like an IEEE or with a NIST? NIST has a lot of things coming out about, they always want input on things. Now they're into like the post-quantum thing, right? And that's what I just got another one from them today. You guys are probably on that list too. So I was thinking about, as we look at practical answers, like you were saying, John, practical applications of something that we can do together, as well as the collaborations that get people working together to create those. Those were the things that went through my mind, but I didn't land on something new yet.
Yeah, that at least helps my thinking. That it's places either in other domains, non-academic domains, either standards or industry groups. It's an interesting one.
Or other NSF or NIH or whatever funded organizations or centers.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good question, and I don't know that I have an answer, but I think John's point of kind of networks or collaboration of collaborators. I mean, we did a little of that in terms of cross advertising, obviously, with CASC. There's CARC as well, and so I think those are, you could look at this as sort of tiered, maybe, in terms of how do we inform those organizations of what we're doing, or maybe how do we engage with them? I mean, those are two very different modes of operation, but we could maybe it would help to think about it. There's lighter touches that we can provide in terms of how we might engage with those individuals.
So I'd like to add just a thought in sort of practical things. The cybersecurity requirement or the security requirements are going to shift with the legislation and then follow-on policy that'll come out in the next year to year and a half in terms of federally funded research, even if that's considered public research, and to get a sense of sort of what's anticipated in that space and what that means for the constituencies that the hubs interact with and facilitate. And because I more and more, there's going to have to be coherence of understanding of policy, implementation of infrastructure, support for domain science, and then what the expectations are for the researchers and the institutions in making sure that the regulations and the policy are sort of, that services and infrastructure are aligned. So I guess I'm just thinking that it would be nice at some point to have one of those sort of extended maybe panels of people from the federal agencies and even AAAS, and obviously I'm including NIST, but AAAS maybe, and certainly maybe the CCC to sort of have a roundtable kind of discussion that would be fruitful for the hub constituencies. So just a thought.
Very interesting.
We might have skipped a step that would either help hurt my thinking. We touched on two kind of general areas, both of which feel fruitful. There's even forgotten what you called it, but incidents and response and resilience and so forth as kind of a general area that's pretty broad, but more focused than the entire world. And then also the security and data science nexus. If we declared those two areas just to be somewhat arbitrarily, but not in a bad way, the ones that we want to kind of move forward on this year and learn more about and maybe make progress on, that would perhaps inform the kinds of organizations that we might partner with.
Yeah, that would be fun. So yeah, we're currently calling it Picnic, which is pandemic.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah.
Information commons and natural hazard and disaster. Information commons and collaboration. Of course, if you have a commons, it means you're collaborating is the idea. And there's an infrastructure associated with it. Yeah, that could be. And that's something that I think the steering committee can think about.
Yeah. I raised a little bit of reaction here. Does that feel too narrow to people? Or too constraining, or too broad? Or...
I think it's a good start personally, you know, because we already have a leg moving. I don't know if it's a leg up, but a leg moving on both of them. Yeah, I know, kind of a leg twitching anyway on both of them.
Yeah.
On the cybersecurity side with this great core team. And we can always engage the rest of the folks that got involved in April once we know where we want to go and see if they want to jump in. And on the pandemics, natural hazards, that's something I have to get working more on anyway. And so we should all do it together. And our organizations are actually working in it. We might not currently work with those people, you know, but TAC has a whole thing going on, you know, UT. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is very interesting to think of what else we can do. Oh, Jay has your hand up. I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Rand?
Oh, that was from before. That was from before.
Sorry.
No problem. And then Rand was a response to your question about who to ask about the public policy stuff.
Oh, okay.
Rand to the think tank.
So would it be, I'm trying to rephrase some of what you were saying there, John, about sort of an approach. Would it be fair to say that what you're talking about would be sort of one way of examining the interplay between cybersecurity, cyber infrastructure, and physical infrastructure? Or physical, maybe not infrastructure is the wrong word, but
I don't think I was suggesting that we try to match up the security and natural hazards, now I remember, world, but more that we just constrain ourselves to maybe thinking about two parts of the world, mm-hmm. Just to get a little bit of focus.
Right.
I think it's good to start with one or two things, and then we can see how they go. Really? Or,
right.
You know, I think we have a couple of other options here. There's the supply chain thing we were talking about. There's data and physical supply chains, which is interesting. Data supply chains refers, all of us have data supply chains. What Jim was bringing up, I don't want to make him talk again, on the middle layers or middleware, depending how you want to look at it, for making data more accessible and seamless. How to aggregate data, gathering data, sharing data. That's like a big kahuna problem. So we'd probably have to find a place to start, but it sounds like the ag and water folks are starting that. Are you actually going to approach that, John, in that workshop proposal that you did for the research data management?
Yeah, we are approaching that from the relatively narrow perspective of aquatic invasive species as sort of the framing situation, but it's exactly what Jim was talking about. Is, you know, you have all these very disparate data sources that a number of communities would like to leverage, and so how do you bring those together in a virtual way that doesn't involve creating, you know, one giant system, which is not going to work. So what's the infrastructure that gets you to a functional system without having to integrate the actual data resources?
Yeah, great.
Okay, good. And we didn't make Jim talk. That's good. Okay, so that's, you know, another one. So I colored in blue the two that you mentioned, John, since you're on the steering committee, but all of these are on here. And I know we only have a few minutes. So I think this was a great collaborative discussion to get some ideas on the table that I think will be good input to the steering committee.